I'm glad to have you here. This is something to talk about with the Senior Community Center. And we are grateful for sponsorship by Fieldstone Communities of Bainbridge Island, which is offering memory care and independent living and soon opening assisted living units next month, August, which may be this month, depending on when you're watching this video. Call 360-594-1010 to schedule a tour of Fieldstone's apartments on Rolling Bay today. Also, we'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish Suquamish tribe, the people of the clear salt water, who have lived here since time immemorial. We honor them. We're grateful for their hospitality and their stewardship. We had hoped to be talking today with Emily Pickney about program that Climate Solutions is working on for helping businesses acclimate to climate change. And although she's ill, we will work to reschedule that. But we also have Mike Kelly here, who is one of the facilitators of the Citizens Climate Lobby on Bainbridge and in the state. And I appreciate you coming, Mike, to talk a little bit about the work that you're doing and the progress that we're making on Bainbridge and the progress we have yet to make as we not only do what we can to stop using fossil fuels and move to a more energy carbon conscious future, but also make adaptations, because obviously, as we've seen, the proof of the respected theories about climate change are unfortunately coming true every day.
Thanks, Reed.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to hearing Emily's presentation as well, because I think Climate Solutions does great work here in the state, especially at the state and local level. And I'm really glad to see them doing outreach to businesses, because I think that's going to be a really important area, and we'll touch on a little bit of that. I'm going to talk about Citizens Climate Lobby, which is a national organization with over 400 chapters around the United States, including one here on Bainbridge Island that I'm the group leader of. And I'll tell you a little bit about my background. So I am, as I mentioned, Bainbridge Island co-group leader, along with two other folks here on Bainbridge. I'm also just recently became the state co-coordinator. So I'm helping organize the state of Washington with another woman who lives on Mercer Island. And we have chapters all around the state, in Eastern Washington, in Southern Washington, down in Vancouver, up in the islands, obviously Seattle, Bainbridge Island, Vashon, Tacoma. So we're fairly well organized here. And my own background is I'm actually a tech employee. Reed and I actually knew each other from when we were both working at Microsoft several years ago. And about 12 years ago, I started my own company here on the island that is a tech consultancy company, working with software companies. And I just retired from that last year. So I'm now enjoying my retirement and spending more time on CCL. I've been involved with CCL since about 2015, and it just is a really great organization that I think does a great combination of national and local. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what they're doing and also what we're doing here locally on Bainbridge, because Bainbridge has really become kind of a local leader in terms of how it's addressing climate change, which is great to see. First, as I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know about climate change. I'm going to talk a little bit about Citizens Climate Lobby, and then what actions individual folks can take. So if we had a bigger audience, I would do a little bit of a poll here, because we know that people kind of divide up into groups according to how much they know and are aware of climate change. Since this is mostly going to be a video presentation, I'm going to go through a little bit of background on climate change, although I'm going to assume that most people are somewhat aware of this, and there is so much more information out there. So if you're a skeptic on climate change or feel like you don't know a lot, you should be able to find a lot of content. And I'll even get to the end where you can find that from Citizens Climate Lobby as well. But this sort of divides up, and we know from some of the public opinion research that we do that Americans have gone through a transition on this over the last 10 or 12 years. Where the number of people that are unaware of climate change or disengaged from it has actually become fairly small. And the largest group now that it compromises about 40 or 45% of the population is what we call the alarmed. And so they are people that recognize climate change is real. They see it all around them. They're worried about it, but they're not sure what to do. And they're not sure how their own actions can take effect. And that's what I'm going to hopefully talk about, is what we can do, because us taking action is going to be important. So basically, to move people down to that fourth bullet here, where we're actively working both at the local level and the national level, because both are going to be important in terms of addressing this problem.
I feel like a lot of the people that I've talked to feel like they're not clear how much difference us as individuals can make, and not clear about how you can move corporations and the government because of the intransience of a lot of our political climate right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a better challenge. And I would say that what I've seen just in the, as I said, about 6 or 8 years that I've been involved in this actively, is there really has been a change of it becoming much more a central part of the policy discussion in Washington, and with corporations as well. You can be somewhat cynical or kind of skeptical about how real that is, but I do think we see some real changes in companies that really are trying to figure out how they can mitigate, and obviously people as well. And I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing on Bainbridge on that. So just quick sort of, I'll try to get through this quickly, because as I said, I think there's a lot of information out there, but at a high level, we just know that the greenhouse gases, CO2, carbon dioxide, and methane primarily, but others as well, that we've been putting into the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels just cause more of the heat's energy to be retained. And that's why they're called greenhouse gases. It basically makes us into more of a greenhouse where we're retaining that heat. And this is becoming an increasing problem. We know the biggest driver is fossil fuels. This is a chart that goes back to the 1900s, and you could just see how much more we're using both coal and oil and natural gas, and all those, using those as putting more and more into the atmosphere. Obviously, these have really powered our economy and produced an enormous amount of advancement and wealth and everything else. And so we can't just turn these off instantly, but we need a strategy and a plan for how we can move away from them as quickly as possible, because of the danger that they're posing to us, and really to our children and grandchildren is probably going to feel the blunt of this. The data is all around us, and I think we see it here in the Northwest. We're seeing it right now in the South, and in Arizona and Texas and Florida. But even here in the Northwest, we're seeing more warm. And so, if you just look at the data, the 19 warmest years in all of recorded human history have occurred in the last 21 years. And the 6 warmest years ever have been the last 6 years. So we're definitely heading in a path of increasing warmth, really all over the world. So what is CCL and Citizens Climate Lobby doing about this? We have a multi-pronged policy agenda, and I'm going to talk more about each of these little areas. One is, we think the cornerstone has to be some sort of pricing on carbon, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but some sort of a fee on carbon usage as a way of driving it down. Forests are a really important part of our mitigation and adaptation plan, and so how do we sort of increase healthy forests, both out in the wilderness, like out on the peninsula and the mountains, but also in urban areas, where I'll talk a little bit about how that's important. Moving more and more to electrification and away from fossil fuels. The biggest fossil fuel we use here on the island is probably propane, but natural gas is used in other areas. Some places even use oil. And ultimately, what the utilities that are generating the electricity are using as well fits into this. So how do we get more and more electrification and then make the electric supply greener? And that feeds into the fourth priority, which is permitting reform. We're actually seeing a lot of renewable energy development happening really all over the country. But the challenge is that our grid is sort of creaking at the seams to be able to adapt to this and allow this to be interconnected. And so we literally have over 100 renewable energy projects in the Pacific Northwest that are in progress, but can't connect up to the electric grid because there just isn't the transmission lines and the interconnect opportunities. And so addressing that and making it more streamlined for that to happen and for that permitting is going to be an important part of the transition. I'll just pause and see if there's any questions here. I'm going to go into each of these in a little more detail, but any questions or comments at this point?
Well, it is interesting that we are, dependent as we are on our utility companies to help make the connection. And I know that PSE is not locally owned. I'm hoping that I know that the Bainbridge itself has had conversations with PSE, and I'm guessing that that their interest in this has grown just like all of our interests has grown.
Yeah, I would say PSE is not as recalcitrant as some of the power companies. My son actually lives in Montana and is involved in climate change stuff there. And the power company there is pretty recalcitrant and pretty difficult to deal with at Northwest Power. PSE is not as bad as that. I mean, they do have a large coal plant that's actually in Montana in Colstrip, which we've been pushing them to shut down and move more to renewables. And that ties into this whole, permitting reform and interconnect is can they, because coal has the advantage of being already connected. They know how to operate it. They know what the reliability of it is. And so, dealing with some of those issues and getting more and more. We also have the advantage in the Northwest that we get so much of our power from hydro as well. And so hydro and wind is a really great source here, and especially in Eastern Washington, obviously. And so that's a big advantage for the Pacific Northwest over other areas like in the Northeast that are much more dependent on oil and gas.
And obviously, there are costs that we'll be talking about. I know that the governor, in particular, has been in for a lot of criticism because of the increase in the price of gasoline, which leads to some finger pointing back and forth about whose fault that is.
Yeah, and that's a great segue into our carbon pricing pillar. This is really kind of the founding pillar of Citizens Climate Lobby and the core policy that we advocate. And really the idea here is to put a price on carbon at the point of basically where it enters the energy stream. So at the wellhead, at the at the gas plant, and then have that fee collect all that fee, but then rebate that money to the American people. And that's the part that is so far kind of missing from what happened in Washington State, although I think there are plans to kind of do some of that work down the road. But it's so if you collect all this money, and ultimately it is going to be quite a bit of money if you have a strong enough fee on carbon to really reduce demand, it will have an impact on people. Gas prices are going to go up. Oil prices are going to go up, and so how do you deal with that, especially for people that are the most vulnerable and where they may not be able to pay that? And our solution there is to do a per capita redistribution of the money. So the government doesn't keep the money. It distributes it out in a monthly check to people. And you'd think, well, that doesn't make any sense. If you're just going to take the money and then give it back to me, then it's not going to change my behavior at all. But in fact, we've done a lot of modeling, and there are other countries like Canada that is using this now. And people still see that price. They still see the price at the gas station. They see the price on their energy bills. So it incents them to do more energy conservation. And with the dividend, we've given them some of the money to be able to do that, to weatherize their house, to be able to maybe take a different, maybe buy a more fuel efficient car. And so that's the strategy here. And the important thing is the dividend is not based on your own carbon usage. It's per capita, so everybody gets the same. And when we do the economic modeling, we find that the bottom half of the income distribution, basically people in the bottom half, end up coming out ahead. So yes, they will pay more for gas, they will pay more for energy at home, but the dividend will more than offset that for them, so that they'll be made whole. And people higher up in the economic distribution will end up paying a little bit more, but it won't be that significant to them because of the amount of money they have. So wealthier people tend to live in larger houses. They may have 2 or 3 cars rather than one, and so they end up having a higher usage of energy, and so they're going to pay more in the increase, and they're still going to get the same dividend as somebody who maybe takes the bus and lives in a small apartment and won't have the same usage fees. So that's the strategy, and this is what we've been pushing. The other thing that's important to us here is that this be a bipartisan bill, that this isn't just a Democratic or Republican proposal, but that it is bipartisan. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, we really believe that only bipartisan action is ultimately going to be sticky in the long run. If you pass something in a totally one-sided view, the next time the other party is in power, they're just going to reverse it, and then that's kind of pretty bad for for this. And this is something we're going to have to sustain for 20, 30, 40 years. So we're going to have Republican Congresses and Democratic Congresses. We're going to have Republican presidents and Democratic presidents over those 40 years. And we need this to be something that is not a political football that's going back and forth. We also think that by doing the rebate and not having the government keep the money, so we're not growing the government, this makes it more attractive to Republicans. And so we're working with Republicans now to try to get them on board with this. And we're finding a fair amount of receptiveness, to the idea of, yeah, let's do this where it's not growing the government and it's not the government picking winners and losers, because ultimately the market is deciding based on carbon usage. So this is kind of our main pillar, is carbon pricing. But we don't think that in and of itself is going to be enough. We also have to work on forests. And so being climate smart about forestry, obviously the wildfires that we're seeing in Canada that are affecting the East Coast. I was in Washington, D.C. in June for a national conference, and you couldn't see the Capitol dome because the smoke was so thick. Fortunately, it mitigated while I was there. So it was the worst day was the day I arrived, but it has happened again. And this isn't just in rural areas or in pure forests. It's also, what are we doing in urban areas? We know that trees can reduce surface temperatures by 20 to 40 degrees on very hot sunny days. So that's a huge impact for livability of urban areas and kind of the adaptability to these hotter days that we're seeing by being able to have more tree canopy. They also have other benefits. For example, they don't stress the pavement either on the roads or the sidewalks as much as that unrelenting sunshine. So you end up having longer lives for the pavements. You end up having, not as much maintenance costs. So there's a lot of advantages to doing more urban, urban forests, urban trees. And we all know, we see a nice leafy street. That's where we want to live. That looks nice. And so we just need to do more of that in more areas around the country. Building electrification, I've already talked some about, so this really is sort of emphasizing, and I'll talk a little bit about one of the programs that's happening here in Bainbridge to encourage people to move away from propane and away from oil. I don't think there's that many oil furnaces, although my next door neighbor had one not that long ago, but move away from those to heat pumps. We are kind of the ideal place for heat pumps here in the Northwest because we don't get super cold days and we don't get super hot days. And so basically the heat pump is very good at moving heat from one place to another when there isn't a huge amount of difference between them. And so that is where we really can get efficiency. And I've had a heat pump in my house for really since we moved in, and I really enjoy it. And it's a great use, and because it uses electricity, it's then as we green and make renewable the electric grid, will benefit from that as well. Yeah, there's a question.
Yeah, Sheila.
Mike, how does a heat pump work? I hear what you're saying, but how does it work?
So one way to think about it is, what your refrigerator does is it moves heat from inside the refrigerator to outside the refrigerator. And that's how it keeps it cold, right? Is that it actually moves heat outside. And that's what the compressor in the back and the engine and the fan are doing, is they're moving heat. And that's what a heat pump does, except it can do it the other way, right? So it can take heat, and even on a cold day, even when it's 40 degrees outside or 35 degrees outside, there still is heat in that air. And so it can, using electricity, basically move that heat from outside to inside. And then it also can work in reverse. So on a very hot day, when it's maybe 85 or 90 degrees here, it can move the heat from inside to outside and be able to cool your house as well. So it works both ways, and it can be reversible. And the heat pumps that they're building now are quite efficient. So they're very efficient at being able to do that heat movement without needing to use a lot of energy. And as I said, where they start to be problematic is, and they're working on this, but like in the Northeast, where you might get days where it's -10 or -15 degrees, then you've got a harder time. It's going to have to work very hard to move the little bit of heat that's in that air. There's a big difference between what you want your house to be at maybe 68 or 70 and what the outside temperature is. And so the heat pump has to work very hard to be able to do that. But here in the Northwest, where we tend to be fairly moderate, the heat pumps are super efficient and are really good to do. And so we're working with, through the Inflation Reduction Act, which was the bill that was passed last August, there's a lot of money to encourage people to do heat pumps. And PSE is also doing a program on this. So we're working through the city to try to get people aware of this. How do they qualify for these, and how are they able to convert and get some of that money so that they're able to do that? Thanks for the question. And then our final policy pillar that we're working on is clean energy permitting reform. And so this really is addressing the problem of, as we're making a major transformation in our energy infrastructure, really, I kind of think of this as almost like what we did when we built the interstate highway system in the 50s and 60s. It was a huge transformation of the country, and it required a lot of local cooperation in terms of where the roads were going to run, whose houses were going to get moved. And frankly, that wasn't always done in the best way. Well, it wasn't always done in a way that was most sympathetic to people, and there was definitely political power used there. So what can we learn from that? And as we're making this transition to be able to do more transmission lines and more interconnects for the renewables, and also where the renewables are going to go, right? I mean, some people feel like, I don't really like looking at wind turbines, and so how can we deal with that and find where these are located, because they can be super efficient at being able to generate. So it's really about, how do we make it so that it's easier to get things integrated in to the grid, the electrical delivery system, as we're building these renewables, because there's a lot of demand for these renewables. And what's really been one of the most surprising things, and I think people didn't predict this back in the early 2000s as we were looking at where climate change was going, the modeling has actually been pretty good in terms of what the change was going to be in climate. What I think the modeling was a little off on is how efficient and cost efficient renewables were going to be. At that time, there was maybe as much as a 10-time cost difference between using fossil fuels and using renewables. And so there were government subsidies were required. That cost difference has come down to where in a lot of cases now, it's actually more efficient from a dollar point of view to use a solar collector than it is to use a coal plant or a gas plant. And so, being able so that's driving a lot of investment in these. But then we need to connect them into the grid so that they can actually deliver electricity to homes and businesses in where it's needed. And a lot of times,
I know that in Texas, I've read they're actually, although it's a pretty red state that you would think might be reticent to adopting solar, it's so efficient because obviously there's lots of solar there, there's lots of sun there, and wind that they're making transitions just for, as you say, economic reasons alone.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting, there was a move by some people in the Texas legislature to try to make it more difficult to permit wind and solar. And what happened was there was actually a backlash from local utility districts and local mayors and governments, many of whom are conservative Republicans, but say, hey, this just makes sense. Like, we can get basically free energy from the wind that's blowing. Like, we want to be able to do that. And it's definitely helping in Texas. And Texas has become one of the big leaders in this because, as you say, they've got the wind and they've got the sun. And I think they're also seeing very harshly the consequences of climate change now, and so I think that will drive even more of this, hopefully.
Tom, do you have a comment? Okay.
It's really a great program. Excellent. Thank you.
Okay, good.
Thanks, Tom. So I just want to sort of give a little bit about what we have really been working on bipartisan climate legislation. We got 4 of those, including the omnibus bill that was a budget bill that put a lot of money into kind of addressing some of the climate change needs and building some of this stuff. The bipartisan infrastructure bill, huge increase in amount of funding for infrastructure around this. And then we had other climate bills passed as well through at least one house, and we're continuing to work on those. The Growing Climate Solutions Act is a really interesting bill, again, that has bipartisan support, and it's about how do we help farmers use more energy efficient and carbon emission efficient methods of farming that both reduce their costs, so benefit them, and also help them sequester carbon. And farmland is a huge place to be able to put carbon in the ground rather than in the air. So that's kind of an interesting solution, and we've seen support for that from both Republicans here in Washington State as well as Democrats. So where can you get more information? First of all, you can certainly contact me and I'd be happy to talk to anybody. We do a weekly session that's online. You could just go to this URL and you'll be able to hear a little talk and ask questions and so forth. This is the way our kind of main onboarding of folks that want to join. And then we also have this website that has more information about the Energy Innovation Act, which is what we call our carbon pricing and dividend bill, the Energy Innovation Act. And in the last Congress, it had 95 co-sponsors, including our congressman here on Bainbridge Island, Representative Derek Kilmer. So we're going to get that reintroduced. It has to kind of, as the Congresses turn over, the bills have to get reintroduced. So we're working on getting that reintroduced now, and we're hoping to have a similar number. So that's my sort of national pitch. I'm going to switch now to Bainbridge Island and what's happening here. So if anybody has any questions about any of the national policies or what we're doing, I'm happy to take those. Otherwise, I'll switch to Bainbridge.
Let's go local.
Okay, great. Locally, we work with the Climate Change Advisory Committee, which is an official committee of the Bainbridge Island Council. The council established this back about, I think, 3 or 4 years ago now, to advise them on climate change mitigation and what they could do here in the city. And one of the recommendations that came out of that a couple of years ago was you should hire a full-time staffer to work on these things. And so Autumn Salmonek was hired about 1.5 years ago now to be the city's first climate mitigation and adaptation officer. And she's been working really well and doing a great job. She came to us from Shoreline, where she was doing some of this work as well. And so these are the things that are in the climate change plan for Bainbridge of what things they are working on around mitigation and adaptation. So we know we're going to see sea level rise here, probably about 1 foot on Bainbridge Island, which, if you look at some of those low-lying houses along the Sound, that will be significant. So how do we mitigate that? We will see probably not as extreme as what we're seeing now in Texas and Arizona, but we certainly will see increases in temperature and more heat events. And so I think actually the senior center, Reed, right, is becoming one of the sort of cooling centers on the island where people can go if they're too hot at home and they can't cool off.
That's right. And also Bainbridge Prepares is working on a number of things so that since many people don't want to relocate, figure out how they can do things with fans. And we were talking about smoke in the air, how you can use a fan as a filter. So yeah, there's some great nonprofit work on the island to try to help folks, respond to some of the climate changes.
Yeah. And we will see wetter winters. We will see, drier summers, more extreme precipitation events. Again, I think this is happening in other places where, I think I just read that there were like 8 or 9 inches of rain in like a very short amount of time in Vermont and New Hampshire last. And so, just the amount of flooding and everything is kind of shocking. And so hopefully we won't see something like that, but we know we will get wetter. And we also, wildfires will be a risk to us. We're kind of fortunate this summer that we haven't seen that. It's been mostly in the east from the Canadian wildfires, but we know it's just a matter of which way the wind's blowing, right? So if the wind blows a different way, we're going to get smoke here. And so how do we deal with that?
And the risk of wildfires in our neighborhood. We have to be we're on a pretty strict burn ban right now because it doesn't take much given how dry it's been and the drought that we're sort of experiencing most parts of the year. It's kind of funny. It's like you get enormous rainfall and then you get nothing.
Yeah. And it's a big. And then mountain snowpack. There's actually a group called Preserve Our Winters that is the sponsored by the ski industry to try to keep mountain snowpack. And how do we deal with that? But we know we will have less snowpack, and so so much of our water here comes from the mountain snowpack that accumulates over the summer, or over the winter rather. And we can see in California too that more is not necessarily good. They had sort of record snows last year. And now they're dealing with the consequences of that, is all that snow is melting very quickly and flooding areas that hadn't previously been flooded and so forth. So it is going to be a lot of challenges to deal with these. So these are the things we're sort of thinking about here locally, and that the city council has established as the areas to focus on. So what's actually happening in the last year or so while Autumn has been working on the city staff? Well, they really want to use the city of Bainbridge Island as a sort of model citizen in reducing emissions. So sort of fix your own home first and then help. So moving from gas-powered landscaping tools, and you can look on the COBE website, there's a video where the landscape landscaping staff talks about how they've mitigated they moved away from almost all of their gasoline powered tools and are using electric tools and the advantage of that. There's also about 40 or 50 vehicles in the city fleet itself. So electrifying those and making those electric vehicles, expanding heat pump usage, which I had mentioned earlier. So this is a program that they're getting going to try to help. We know that there's all this money out there from the Inflation Reduction Act. It's the largest climate legislation ever passed. And so now we just need to help people tap into that. And what are the rules? And the rules are still getting written exactly how people will qualify for these, but there will be significant tax credits, to be able to get, to be able to do heat pump conversion. And so the city is working on trying to, pick some people, basically sort of figure out how they can help city residents plug into that so that everybody doesn't have to go figure it out themselves and navigate the morass of paperwork and rules and so forth. And then the other interesting thing the city's doing is they got a grant to put 2 shared vehicles by City Hall that are electric vehicles, and there's also extra electric charging stations there. There's chargers for the shared vehicles, but there's also extra chargers. And expanding the charging infrastructure on the island is going to be important as well. So those shared EVs will be available for people that, for example, are maybe, need to just get around the island to run errands, maybe want to be able to walk onto the ferry and so not have to drive and park at the ferry. Those are kinds of things that so they're experimenting with that. And I think those are going to be available. They put the chargers in, so I think they're going to be available like as soon as next month. And there's an app that you download. And again, if you look on the city website, if you go to the city website, there's a section on climate change, and it talks about, there's nice videos on there, and it talks about this program as well and how to get access to that. And then finally, the city has launched this program called Climate Smart Bainbridge, and you can join that through the URL that's here, climatesmartbainbridge.org. And basically, it just gives you a lot of tips about what you can do personally. And there's even, I think, a little contest that's going on of you can kind of, it's like kind of greatest loser kind of contest where it's like who can, reduce their carbon footprint the most, and there's some prizes for that. So, so you can check that out as well. Any other questions about Bainbridge or any other comments about Bainbridge?
I was talking with Greg Drunkard about the shared vehicle, and apparently they're also looking at trying to get a shared van, which I think would be exciting. We could use it for some of our smaller excursions from the senior center.
Yeah.
We currently have a 22 passenger vehicle, a bus that we're working to try to get converted to hybrid electric. We couldn't quite coordinate seeing how to get it completely electrified, finances being an issue, but using a hybrid drivetrain will save some of that fossil fuel anyway.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think hybrid is a totally reasonable transition strategy, right? And I do think that there's going to be so many more electric vehicle choices in the next few years as the infrastructure comes on and everything else. So I think there'll be a lot more choices of that. So, and Kitsap Transit, just as an aside, it's not in my slides, but I mean, Kitsap Transit is really a pretty thought leader here on this. They've got a number of buses that are electric. They've got, they're really thinking about for the fast ferry, making that battery. And so they really are that group is very, very thoughtful and very forward-looking in terms of what they're doing for the transit infrastructure. Well, I'm going to just start by saying, hey, anything that people learned or relearned or really took away from this, and any actions that you feel like you want to take now, and any other questions?
Well, I have a question about
Well,
everybody connected.
you better talk. Hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I have a question about all the junk you buy at the store, like clamshells and the various things that cannot be recycled. Is there any, I know there's Zero, what's the name of the organization, but it seems like the stores have more and more and more of this stuff, and it's hard to purchase anything.
Microphone is a little choppy, but I think I hear that you're asking about packaging that is wasteful and how that contributes to climate. And it seems to you like there's even more and more of these clamshells and other ways that people pack things that contribute. Any comment on that, Mike?
Yeah, I didn't put it in the list, but that is one of the things that the city has also done, is this sort of zero waste approach, which is they're really working with the retailers on the island and on really trying to reduce the amount of wasteful packaging and non-compostable, non-recyclable packaging is what this target is. Unfortunately, a lot of the plastics really end up not being recyclable. They're very difficult. They can be reused. So, if you sort of go back to the 3 R's of back in the 70s when recycling first started coming in, it was reduce. That's the highest priority, right? So I think, Tom, that's what you're talking about, is like, how do we reduce the amount of this packaging? Because if you never have it in the first place, then it's not a problem. And the second one is reuse, right? So how do you reuse it and make it be something? And then recycle is sort of the third priority, because it is more energy intensive, and it is, it can be complicated, especially plastics, because there are so many different layers and laminates and stuff. So to be able to recycle that stuff is tricky. So I totally hear you. And I mean, I think the only thing we could do is, this is where our own personal actions can have some impact. I know when I go to TNC and buy vegetables, I usually just leave them loose. I don't take the plastic bags, and unless I really need to. I mean, usually I can just take 3 apples and put 3 apples on the conveyor and bring 3 apples home, and there's no need for any additional packaging. So we could do that by just trying to reduce our own usage. And then I think just mentioning to retailers, if you do see stuff that you think is extra wasteful, just pointing it out to them and saying, hey, is this something we really need, or can we reduce this? And I know TNC seems to, at least from my perspective, have been somewhat of a leader on this in terms of the amount of compostable stuff they've got, and they're documenting, they've got the little bins explaining what can go where and so forth. So I had lunch there a week ago or so, and I mean, I think I threw one thing in the trash. Everything else either went into recycling.
I don't know who you are.
They now have, if you're eating there, you can actually use their plates.
Right.
So you actually don't even have to have any packaging at all, and it'll get washed and reused.
Right. Another example of reuse, right? So
for people who are concerned that individual efforts can only go so far, do you have any comments about how what's the interplay between what we do and what substantial things like corporations and the government can do?
Yeah, and I mean, I think everybody is different on this. I mean, you can see that I spend most of my time on an organization focused on national change and national policy. And that's what's rewarding to me, and that's where I feel like I have the biggest impact. But I understand that there are other people that say, that just feels too abstract and too remote and too, kind of long-term. I want to do something locally. And so that's where I think some of the things that like Climate Smart Bainbridge are doing can really have a feeling of like, hey, I'm making a personal impact. And, is it going to solve climate change? No. But is it going to be part of the solution and raising awareness? I think it absolutely is. And I mean, we are all going to have to change. The way that we've lived our lives in the last 50 years is probably not going to be sustainable, and I mean, I get off my sort of CCL podium here because this isn't exactly probably what CCL would see, but I see everybody complaining about, the gas price raises under Inslee, and it's like, well, yes, but we have to look at what the alternative is, right? We probably can't have as much gas usage in the next 20 years as we've had in the last 20 years. And so there's going to have to be a transition there. Now, doing that in a just way so people are treated fairly, I think is important, right?
Yeah. And I know that we did actually have a initiative a few years ago that we voted down.
Yes.
That would have put in exactly the kind of a payback method so that you talk about in your national bill.
Yes.
Yeah. So, you can either pay me now or pay me later, but you're going to have to pay.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, and hopefully we could do it in a way where, as I said, people are treated fairly and we don't have, the people who are the least able to afford it. And to me, that is the one that I think is, I was fortunate a couple of years ago to be in a meeting with the Seattle Times editorial board about our policy. We were trying to get them to take a position on it. And one of the editorial board members said, I worry about the guy who lives in Eastern Washington who's got to drive 50 miles a day, you know, just to get to his job and needs a pickup truck because that's what his job requires. You know, what's this going to do to them? And I think it's a very fair question. And I mean, it's a very fair thing to say, how do we make that so that, you know, that person probably maybe still sees some impact of like reducing the usage, but not overly penalized and made so that they can't work. So that is a very fair question. It's sort of,
very much.
So think that we're seeing in those individual consumer choices, things that will speak to the corporations to make changes. The more people who are using electric cars means more charging stations, means a lower, I mean, we're now seeing electric pickups, as you mentioned. And so it becomes then an option, maybe not for everybody, but it at least moves the whole culture in that direction.
and one of the things I like about the carbon pricing is that it is an economy-wide solution. In other words, you know, we don't need corporations then to be convinced to do the right thing. They're going to look at the cost. I mean, here's just one example. You know, people have heard about this cryptocurrency, you know, that uses enormous amounts of computing power to be able to generate these digital currencies. Well, you know, that's based on, they build a lot of that computing capacity out in Wenatchee and in Eastern Washington because of the cheap hydropower that's available there. If we had a carbon price, we don't need to regulate the things away. We don't need to ban it. It's just the pricing is going to get built in and suddenly it just doesn't become cost effective. And so I think the carbon price can really cause millions of little decisions to be made at a corporate level and an individual level that will end up moving us in the right direction and also will unleash innovation and thoughts that we don't even know now what kinds of things would be possible. But if suddenly, you know, there is that economic incentive, people will emerge to take advantage of that. So that's kind of my strongest pitch for carbon pricing is that, yes, there will be some pain, but I think it also has the potential to have some real upsides of creating things that we can't even imagine right now. So.
And although it looks a little untenable in Washington today, it sounds like CCL is doing a lot of legwork or groundwork so that when the tempers recede a little bit, when we start to talk more rationally again, we'll be ready to move.
Well, and I think also just the as people are like, you see a lot less climate change denial now when the evidence is so clear in front of us in the South and in the West and so forth. So I think as people start looking for, okay, we need to do something. I think it was Winston Churchill who said, you know, America will always do the right thing in the end, but only after first trying everything else. And so, you know, it may end up being a little while before we get there, but we hope we will get there.
Well,
I'm going to put up just my contact info, and if anybody
Okay.
has questions, please feel free. That's my phone and email. I'd be happy to talk to anybody. I'd be happy to talk more about CCL or what's happening here on Bainbridge. And really appreciate the time and the interest. If there are any other questions, I'm happy to take.
Thank you very much, Mike. I really appreciate it, and we'll share this information widely.